Hello, my name is Avery Anjard, and today I will be presenting my analysis on the animated movie industry, both with past and present, and what it looks like around the world. Alright, so the main thing that I want to focus on is how the popularity of both traditional animation and computer animation has changed over time, and how it differs in other countries. So just get some preliminary definitions out of the way. I have defined traditional animation in this analysis as animation where each frame is hand-drawn individually. This is in opposition to computer animation, where the animator can manipulate a digital model of a character or prop, kind of like a puppet. So most of this will be 3D animation, although there is also some 2D computer animation, kind of like flash animation. So this top graph right here is showing just the number of animated movies of each method, and this bottom graph is showing the proportion of movies. Okay. And these numbers that we're looking at right now are global. As we can see here, for the past around like 15 or so years, it's been about even 50-50 traditional and computer animation. But if we look at someplace like the United States, you can see a pretty different story. Starting around 2004 2005, computer animation started becoming the dominant form of animation. Now, it has remained at least 50%, at 50% of all animated films, sometimes even going up to almost 80%. Then if we look at Japan, we can see that the opposite is true. Computer animation never really took off there, and traditional animation remains the most dominant form of animation there. Right. And then to investigate this, I first want to look at the money side of things, because one of the most common reasons that I see people give as to why computer animation became so popular in the United States is because it's cheaper to make. Right, and then so I have this top graph right here showing the average budget for animated movies year after year. And all this has been adjusted for inflation to around 2025. As we can see, that's red line here. On average, computer animated movies have a bigger budget than traditional animated movies. So you can see that initial claim that I talked about just isn't really true. Right, and then I also looked at the revenue to budget ratio, which is just revenue divided by budget. So this is how many times its budget a movie made in revenue. So see, of course, some of the most successful movies ever made were traditional animated movies. Let's see, Bambi made over 300 times its budget. And then we'll kind of filter the dates here so we can get a better look at computer animation. The 90s here. So again, these are global numbers, but you can see starting off, computer animated films were more successful than traditional, but as we go on, especially in the past 10 years or so, traditional animated movies have been much more popular, especially Japanese films. So globally, traditional animated films are more successful, but again, if you look at just the United States, computer animated films actually tend to be more successful on average, with the exception of a couple years here and there. And also, I'd like to note that movie studios don't really like to give out their budget information, so that's why there's some gaps in the data here. So, again, if we go back to all the data here, if you look at what the most successful movie is year after year, the United States is the most prominent country that comes up. Should see later on, we'll see some more movies from Japan, at least for traditional animation. But if we go to computer animation, that's where the US then tends to dominate there. Moving forward though, we go back to traditional animation real quick. It's pretty much only Japan there now, at least for the past decade or so. And then if we go back to, again, computer animation, US. But China has started to pop up a little bit. And then we shall take a closer look at that, how China started to become more prominent in animation. Through these maps right here. Right? And so this first map is showing just a number of animated movies per country. And this data has been filtered to movies that actually have budget and revenue data, just so that this map is easier to compare to the next map on profit. So looking at the US, we have around over 300 animated movies in total. And see, it is, again, the most dominant country, at least for this map. Japan is the next closest, but we only have around 55. Again, not really close. Look at traditional animation, it's a little bit closer. Still the US has the most. And then we go to computer animation, again, US. The next biggest countries are the UK, France, and then Japan. And Japan also up there, but China has 10. But if we go to this next average profit map, we see a pretty different story. That China has the highest average profit for animated films at $363 million. The US isn't too far behind, but still it is second to China in this regard. Then the next highest countries in terms of average profit are Australia and Japan. But they are still around 1/3 of what China and the US makes. You can see most of that profit, or at least all of that profit actually, for China at least comes from computer animation. For traditional animation, China there, and US again, most popular, where it has the most average profit. And this last map I'll show you right here. So this is showing the most successful movie for each country. Again, this is based on revenue to budget ratio. The colors here represent what method was used for this most successful movie. As we can see, most of these are actually computer animated. With a couple of traditional animation here. A big exception is, I say this again, Bambi, most successful animated film ever, made 300 times its budget. For the most part, any country whose most successful movie traditionally animated, even that film still tends not to be very successful, like Longstocking. Its revenue to budget ratio is only 0.04, so it made a lot less than its budget. In Italy, you can eat food too. A couple of exceptions to that, like France, and Love Vincent in Poland. Pakistan's 0.93, so again, less than their budget. So one thing that we can kind of glean from that computer animated films tend to be more successful on average, with the exception of Japanese films. Again, this was a more recent film. So traditional animated films from Japan are pretty successful, but other than that, I've seen that in most other countries it's computer animated films that are more successful. Alright, moving on, we will look at the most profitable production companies and the highest rated. You can see here that most of the profit of these top 10 most profitable production companies come from computer animated films, with the exceptions of Walt Disney and Walt Disney Pictures. The Walt Disney Production and Walt Disney Pictures, where they made the most profitable, most successful films ever in animated history, and a lot of those movies were traditionally animated. But looking at pretty much every other studio, it's all computer animation, like Pixar, DreamWorks, Illumination. So again, that's just telling us computer animation is more profitable, on average at least. And so if we look at this chart on the bottom here, I thought to actually take a look at movie scores. And so these are the top 10 highest rated production companies, and movie scores here have been normalized for a vote count. So movies with maybe 1 10-star vote don't dominate over movies with a little bit of a lower rating but thousands of votes. And these colors here represent the animation method of their highest rated movie. So you can see here that most of these are all like traditionally animated films. And then these three studios right here, they are all production companies that worked on the same film, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. So in a way, we can kind of count those as one company. So what we can glean from that although traditionally animated films may not be as profitable as computer animated films, at least on average, they do tend to be a bit more well-liked. And we'll look at a little bit more of that with this next dashboard, which is looking at the top 5 most common genres for animated films. And I've also included a little bit of information of the average movie score, so we can take a closer look at that. You can see that the average movie score for animated films is 5.66, and the most common genre is family films at 50% of animated movies. And another thing to note is that films can have multiple genres, so that's why the percentages here don't equal or add up to 100. Again, it's family at 50%, then adventure close behind, fantasy, comedy, and then action. If we look at traditional animation, family movies actually are the 4th most common, making only 37% of traditionally animated films, top being adventure. You can see here that traditionally animated films have an average movie score of just over 6, so a bit better than average. And then if we go to computer animation, we can see here that their average score is 4.8, so a little bit less. And for computer animated films, family movies make up over 70% of all computer animated films, so that is a pretty big difference there. So what that tells me is that most computer animated films tend to be geared towards children, so that might be something that explains why they have a lower movie score. Because a lot of movies made for children, unfortunately, tend to have lower standards. And also it could be why they might be more profitable, at least in the US, because most people in the US still view animation as mostly for kids, and adult animation tends to have a more niche audience. We'll take a little bit of a closer look at that in this last dashboard here, showing MPAA ratings. So overall, again, PG and G ratings are the most dominant ratings, of course, around 30%. If you look at traditional animation, though, PG-13 is actually the most common rating, again around 30%, and then SG, then PG. At computer animation, though, over half of all computer animated films are PG rated. SG rating just close behind and making up a large portion of the rest of that. But again, tells me that films or computer animated films are again mostly geared towards children, and those movies tend to make more profit, which of course means that companies are much more likely to, at least in the US, to lean towards computer animation. Alright, and that is the end of my presentation. So in conclusion, while traditionally animated films are not actually more expensive than computer animated films, like many people say, to explain the recent dominance of computer animation, in the US, they do tend to be a little bit more successful, while in Japan, it's traditional animation that tends to be more successful. Traditional animation also tends to have a higher amount of movies with a higher MPAA rating, and since animation is still seen as something exclusively for children in the mainstream, at least in the US, those films tend to make less profit. And then other reasons that I found outside of the data as to why computer animation tends to be more popular, that it's a bit easier to iterate on, and it takes less time to make. So ultimately, the reasons for companies opting for computer animation in the US over traditional animation is a bit more complex than what the data has answers for. Hopefully, we were still able to gain some key insights into the situation. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope I was able to teach you a little bit something about animated films.